Somewhere right now, someone is being manipulated. They don't know it yet. They're sitting across a table from someone who smiled at the right moment, paused at the right moment, said exactly enough, and not a word more, and the deal was already done. The decision has already been made. The only thing left is the paperwork, and the paperwork is just a ceremony. The person being manipulated will go home tonight and feel vaguely wrong. Like something was taken but they can't find the place where it was taken from. They'll pour a drink. They'll sit with that feeling in the dark and eventually call it a bad day and go to sleep. They won't question it. They never do. This is not an accident. Every room you walk into is operating according to rules that were never written down and never explained to you. Every conversation has a current running beneath it, a silent negotiation about who leads and who follows, who matters and who performs the role of mattering, who holds the frame and who gets carried inside it. Most people never feel this current. They only feel the results, the promotion that went to someone less qualified, the relationship that tilted against them without a single argument, the meeting where their idea was ignored and then repeated by someone else to applause. You've felt it. That particular silence when a room has already decided something about you and you walked in too late to change it. That slow realization, hours after a conversation, that you were being managed. That hollow sensation of having said too much, or shown too much, or trusted too quickly, and knowing, somewhere beneath the rationalization, that it cost you something. These are not isolated incidents, they are patterns, and patterns have a logic, and logic, once understood, can be reversed. What you are about to hear has no comfortable name in polite society, but it has a shape, a geometry, a cold, clear, internal consistency that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. The only question worth asking now is this: how long have you been on the wrong side of it? From the moment you were old enough to be corrected, the training began. Not education, training. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that arrives in the form of a parent's disapproval, a teacher's red pen, a peer group's silence when you said the wrong thing. Slowly, methodically, without anyone meaning harm, you were shaped into something legible, something predictable, something that signals its intentions and explains its emotions and apologizes when it takes up too much space. They called it socialization. They called it growing up. What it actually was underneath the good intentions and the reasonable outcomes was a system designed to make you easy to read and therefore easy to manage. Here is the truth that nobody with power will explain to you at a dinner party. The rules you were given were not neutral. They were not simply the agreement that holds civilization together, although some of them are that too. Many of them, the ones about always being transparent, always explaining yourself, always making others comfortable with your presence, those rules benefit the people at the top of every hierarchy far more than they benefit you. Because a person who broadcasts their intentions is a person who can be anticipated. A person who can be anticipated can be controlled. And a person who has internalized the need to be liked, to be approved of, to be seen as good, that person has handed over their most powerful psychological lever without ever being asked to. Most people will never understand power because they are too busy performing virtue to notice they are being outmaneuvered. This is not a cynical statement. Watch any high-stakes environment with clear eyes, a boardroom, a courtroom, a political stage, an elite negotiation, and you will see the same thing repeated without variation. The people who consistently win are not the loudest. They are not the most aggressive. They are frequently not even the most intelligent. They are the most composed, the most intentional, the most selective about what they reveal and when they reveal it. They have understood something that their opponents have not, that in any game where perception shapes outcome, the person who manages perception manages reality. The Stoics understood this long before it had a strategic application. Marcus Aurelius, commanding the largest empire on earth, wrote privately that a man's first and final battlefield is his own interior. Not the armies outside the gate, not the senators plotting in Rome, his own responses, his own exposure, his own need for validation from people who would use that need against him the moment it served them. Machiavelli understood it differently, not as philosophy, but as anatomy. He dissected power the way a surgeon dissects a body, not to judge it, but to understand how it moves, where it is vulnerable, what keeps it alive. What both of them arrived at, from completely different directions, was the same conclusion. Power does not go to the most deserving, it goes to the most prepared. And preparation begins not with tactics, but with the willingness to see the game clearly, without flinching, without moralizing, without looking away. That willingness is rarer than intelligence. It is rarer than ambition. And it is the only real starting point for everything that follows. Your face is lying for you right now. Not in the way you think, not in the crude way of a forced smile or a polite nod, in the way that matters. The micro-expressions that fire before conscious thought catches up. The slight widening of the eyes when something surprises you. The almost imperceptible tightening around the jaw when something threatens you. The softening around the mouth when someone says exactly what you needed to hear. These movements happen in fractions of a second. They are largely involuntary, and to anyone who knows how to read them, and more people know than you realize, they are a complete transmission of your internal state. You think you are guarded, you are not. You are simply unaware of how much you are broadcasting. This is the first law, and it precedes everything else, because without it, nothing else holds. Before you can influence how a room moves, before you can set a frame or read another person's hidden agenda, or position yourself advantageously in any social dynamic, you must first stop leaking. Because every reaction you give is intelligence handed freely to whoever is paying attention. And in any environment where outcomes matter, someone is always paying attention. Think about what a reaction actually communicates. You receive an offer in a negotiation, and your eyes move upward, briefly, a flicker of surprise, and you have just told the other side that their number was not what you expected. Now they know something. Now they have a data point they did not have 30 seconds ago, and they will use it, consciously or not, to recalibrate their position. You walk into a room where someone who wronged you is standing, and something tightens in your posture for half a second, and they feel the shift before you've spoken, and now they know their actions still carry weight with you. Weight is leverage. You gave it to them for free. The great poker players of the world are not emotionless. That is a misreading of what they do. They feel everything, the rush of a strong hand, the cold contraction of a bad draw, the anxiety of a bluff pushed too far. What they have trained, with enormous discipline, is the gap between feeling and expression. They have learned to widen that gap until it becomes a wall. Not a wall that seals them off from experience, but a wall that controls what experience is allowed to show on the outside. Marcus Aurelius called this the discipline of assent, the practiced refusal to let external events write themselves directly onto your face and body before you have reviewed them. It is not detachment. Detachment is the pretense of not caring. This is something harder and more powerful, caring fully and choosing the response anyway. When you develop this, and it is developed, not discovered, it requires months of patient self-observation. Something unexpected begins to happen in the rooms you enter. Without data, without emotional confirmation, without the constant micro-feedback that people unconsciously rely on to calibrate their behavior toward you, they begin to project. The human mind cannot tolerate an unreadable surface for long. It fills the silence with assumption. It assigns depth to stillness. It reads significance into calm. You will not have said anything remarkable. You will not have performed confidence or dominance or authority. You will simply have given the room nothing to grip, and in the absence of grip, the room will have decided you are worth watching. That is the beginning of influence. Not a word spoken, not a move made, just the disciplined, sustained, almost meditative refusal to broadcast what you have not chosen to reveal. Everything else is built on top of this. Without this, everything else is a house with no foundation. People do not see you. This is the first thing to understand, and it is more unsettling the longer you sit with it. What they see is a construction, a rapid, largely automatic assembly of fragments that their brain has stitched together into a coherent story about who you are and what you represent. That story was written in the first few seconds. Everything that happens after is, for most people in most situations, filtered through it, confirmed by it, bent to fit it. The story, once written, becomes the lens, and lenses are extraordinarily difficult to remove once they have been placed. This is not a flaw in human perception. It is an efficiency. The brain processes an incomprehensible volume of sensory information every second, and it cannot evaluate all of it consciously. So it creates heuristics, shortcuts, pattern-matching systems refined over hundreds of thousands of years of social living that allow a rapid assessment, safe or threatening, high value or low value, worth attention or not worth attention. These assessments happen before language, before logic, before any of your carefully constructed arguments or credentials or achievements have had a chance to enter the room. The halo effect is the name psychologists gave to one part of this process, the phenomenon whereby a single strong positive impression in one area radiates outward and colors every other judgment. A person who enters with physical authority is assumed to be intellectually authoritative. A person who speaks with unhurried precision is assumed to have something worth being unhurried about. A person who is visibly comfortable in a high-status environment is assumed to belong there, and belonging, in the social calculus of every room on earth, is itself a form of status that compounds. The inverse is equally merciless. The person who arrives slightly off, slightly rushed, slightly uncertain, slightly over-explaining their right to be present, that person has set a frame around themselves that will require significant effort and time to dismantle, not because the room is cruel, because the room is efficient. It made a decision and moved on, and it will not revisit that decision without a very compelling reason. Here is the Machiavellian implication, stated plainly. This process is happening whether you manage it or not. Every single time you enter a room, a story is being written about you. The question is only whether you are the author or whether you have abandoned the pen and left the writing to chance and the biases of strangers. The strategically minded person understands that perception is upstream of everything, upstream of respect, upstream of opportunity, upstream of how much weight your words carry when you finally speak them. They understand that the most powerful intervention is not the argument made, but the context in which the argument lands. And context is built before the first sentence. It is built in the walk across the room, in the quality of stillness before speaking, in the precise, unhurried selection of what to say and what to permanently leave unsaid. You are always being read. The only variable is what story you are telling while it happens. And that story, its opening, its framing, its central character, is something you can design, not perform, not fabricate. Design, from the inside out, by becoming genuinely and deliberately the thing you intend to project. Perception, shaped by reality, is unshakable. Perception, shaped by performance, eventually cracks. The goal is never the mask. The goal is to become, through discipline and intention, someone whose natural presence tells the story you want told, without effort, without artifice, and without the exhausting maintenance that deception always eventually demands. Most people are terrified of silence. Not in the abstract, in the immediate, physical, social sense of a conversation that has paused too long and sits there breathing between two people like something that needs to be fixed. The nervous system registers it as a breach, a signal that something has gone wrong, that the other person is unhappy, that the relationship is under threat, that you have failed in some unspoken obligation to keep the air filled and the discomfort managed. And so people rush to fix it. They offer things they didn't intend to offer. They explain positions they had no reason to explain. They walk back statements that were perfectly sound simply because the silence that followed those statements felt unbearable. This is one of the most reliable and most exploited vulnerabilities in human social behavior. And the people who understand it use it constantly, quietly, and with extraordinary effect. Here is the mechanism in its simplest form. When you make a statement and then go silent, genuinely, comfortably, without the fidgeting and eye-shifting that signals your own discomfort, you create a vacuum. And a vacuum, in a conversation, exerts pressure. The other person feels that pressure as an obligation to respond, to fill, to resolve. What they fill it with is almost always more revealing than anything they plan to say. Concessions surface. Justifications emerge that expose the weakness underneath a confident position. Emotions bleed through that the other person would have successfully hidden if you had simply kept talking and given them the cover of your own noise. The best negotiators on earth know this. FBI crisis negotiators are trained to treat silence as an active tool, not a passive absence of speech, but a deliberate application of conversational pressure. High-stakes dealmakers let offers sit in the air long past the point of comfort, because they understand that the first person to speak after a number is named has usually moved toward the other side, not away from it. Trial lawyers ask the question and then become stone, because a witness left in silence will almost always say more than was asked. But the silence weapon is not only tactical, it is also a signal, perhaps the most powerful signal available in any social exchange. The person who does not rush to fill every pause, who does not explain themselves beyond what is necessary, who allows their words to land and then waits without anxiety for the landing to settle, that person communicates something that no amount of clever speech can manufacture. They communicate sufficiency, the deep, unperformed sense that they have nothing to prove and nowhere more important to be. This is felt before it is understood. People in the presence of genuine stillness become slightly more careful, slightly more considered. They edit themselves in ways they cannot fully explain. The quiet person at the table, not the silent because uncomfortable person, but the silent because complete person, holds an authority that the loudest voice in the room is working hard and failing to achieve. Learn to be comfortable in the pause, then learn to extend it. Then notice, with the detached curiosity of someone watching weather move across a landscape, exactly what the room does when you refuse to rescue it. Nobody tells you what they actually want. This is not because people are dishonest, although some are. It is because most people do not know. They have a surface want, the raise, the agreement, the apology, the acknowledgement, and they present that surface want as the thing because it is the only part of the thing they have put into words. But underneath that surface, running deeper and older and far more powerful, is the emotional engine that is actually driving the behavior. And that engine almost never gets named. It gets expressed, constantly, loudly, in every overcorrection and defensive posture and disproportionate reaction, but it does not get named. And because it doesn't get named, most interactions stay on the surface, pushing against each other's stated positions, generating heat without resolution, wondering why the logical argument that should have worked didn't work. The answer is always the same. You were arguing with the mask. The real conversation was happening somewhere else entirely. Here is the framework that changes everything. Beneath every stated position is an underlying interest. Beneath every interest is an emotional need. And beneath almost every emotional need, if you follow it far enough down, is one of three things: the hunger to feel significant, the terror of feeling invisible, or the desperate need to believe that something is under control. These three drives, significance, visibility, control, account for a staggering proportion of human behavior in every context you will ever encounter. The colleague who argues against your proposal in the meeting is not, in most cases, actually concerned about the proposal. They are concerned about what endorsing your proposal would mean about their own position, their own relevance, their own standing in the room. The person in a relationship who picks fights about logistics is not angry about logistics. They are angry about something that logistics has become the available language for. Once you see this pattern, you cannot stop seeing it. It is everywhere. It is in every raised voice and every cold withdrawal, and every person who insists on a position long past the point where the evidence has moved on without them. It is in every power struggle that seems to be about principle, but is actually about ego, and every ego conflict that presents itself as principle, because principle sounds better and hurts less to admit. The dark mirror is what you hold up to this. Not to expose people, exposure is crude and earns nothing but defensiveness. But to see clearly, in the privacy of your own understanding, what is actually happening in the exchange. And then to make a choice that most people never get to make, because most people never see clearly enough to make it. You can address the real need directly, beneath the stated position, and watch the entire dynamic shift without a single confrontation. Give the colleague a genuine acknowledgement of their expertise before the meeting, and their resistance to your proposal frequently dissolves on its own. Address the emotional subtext in a conflict before engaging the logical surface, and the conflict often resolves before it escalates. See the hunger underneath the behavior, and you suddenly hold a lever that the other person didn't know they had handed you. This is not manipulation in the predatory sense. It is perception at a level that most people simply never reach. The difference between someone who moves through the world, getting ground down by human friction, and someone who moves through it with unsettling ease, is almost always this. One of them is reading the room at the level of words. The other is reading it at the level of need. There is a law that governs every relationship you have ever been in, every negotiation you have ever entered, every dynamic you have ever felt tilting against you without understanding why. It is not taught in schools, it is not discussed at dinner tables, but it operates with the indifferent consistency of gravity in every human exchange, from the most intimate to the most transactional. The law is this: power flows toward the person who needs the relationship least, not the person who pretends to need it least. Not the person who performs detachment while privately checking their phone every 4 minutes waiting for a response. The person who genuinely, structurally, has the most alternatives. The person for whom the continuation of this particular arrangement, this job, this partnership, this dynamic, is desirable but not necessary. That person holds a position that no amount of charm or intelligence or effort from the other side can fully overcome, because the foundation of their position is not a feeling or a tactic, it is a fact. This is why the candidate with multiple offers negotiates a better salary than the one who needs this job. Not because they are more skilled at negotiating, they may be far less skilled, but because their alternatives are real, and real alternatives restructure the entire geometry of an exchange. The other side feels it. They cannot fully articulate why their usual leverage feels lighter in this particular conversation, but they feel it, and they adjust accordingly. The inverse is equally precise and far more common. Dependency is visible, not always consciously, not always in ways the dependent person would recognize in themselves, but visible nonetheless, in the speed of the response, in the degree of accommodation, in the subtle ways a person makes themselves smaller to preserve an arrangement they cannot afford to lose. And the moment dependency becomes visible, the other side recalibrates, not necessarily with malice, simply because the information is there, and humans, like all negotiating organisms, use the information available to them. The leverage principle does not instruct you to become cold or withholding or strategically unavailable in the shallow way that self-help content occasionally suggests, manufacturing scarcity through ignored messages and calculated delays. That is performance, and performance of this kind is transparent to anyone paying real attention. What it instructs you to do is something slower and more demanding, and ultimately more transformative. Build genuine alternatives. Develop skills, relationships, and resources that exist entirely outside of any single arrangement. Become, through sustained and deliberate effort, someone whose participation is valuable enough and uncertain enough that the question of whether you stay is one the other side thinks about more than you do. The goal is never to threaten departure. The person who threatens to leave and doesn't is weaker after the threat than before it. The goal is to make departure genuinely possible, to yourself first, and therefore, inevitably, to everyone watching. That quiet, structural, unannounced sufficiency is the most durable form of leverage that exists. It requires no maintenance, it generates no conflict. It simply sits beneath every interaction like bedrock, and everyone who stands across from you feels it without knowing its name. Every conversation you have ever had took place inside a frame. You almost certainly never saw it. Neither did most of the people you were talking to. But it was there, an invisible set of assumptions governing what the exchange was about, what the stakes were, whose definitions applied, and whose version of reality was being treated as the default. The frame is the context inside which all content is interpreted. And here is the thing about context that changes everything once you truly understand it. Context does not just influence meaning. Context creates meaning. The identical sentence, placed inside two different frames, becomes two completely different statements. The identical offer, framed as a concession versus framed as a standard term, lands with entirely different psychological weight. The identical person, introduced as an expert versus allowed to introduce themselves, commands a completely different quality of attention. Most people spend their entire lives crafting better content, better arguments, better evidence, better rhetoric, while never once examining the frame those arguments are landing in. They wonder why the superior idea lost. They wonder why the more qualified candidate didn't get the role. They wonder why the reasonable position failed to persuade. The answer, almost every time, is not that the content was insufficient. It is that the frame was already set by someone else, and inside that frame, the content never had a fair hearing. A defense attorney who asks a witness what they were wearing the night of the incident has shifted the frame of the entire exchange without making a single argument. A manager who opens a performance review by saying, "Let's talk about your potential rather than let's talk about your recent numbers," has restructured the psychological context of everything that follows. A negotiator who responds to an aggressive opening offer not with a counteroffer, but with a slow, almost curious silence, followed by the words, "That's an interesting place to start," has refused the frame being offered, the frame in which that number is a serious proposal deserving a serious counter, and replaced it with a frame in which the number is merely a beginning, and a slightly amusing one at that. Frame control is not about deception. It is about understanding that in any exchange, someone is setting the terms of reality, and that person holds an advantage that no amount of superior argument can easily overcome. The person who sets the frame is not arguing from inside the game. They are, in a meaningful sense, designing it. And the person who designs the game wins at a structural level before a single move is made. The most powerful way to establish a frame is never to announce it. Announcing a frame collapses it. It makes the invisible visible, invites challenge, and transforms what was a structural advantage into a debating position. Instead, you inhabit the frame completely and behave from within it as though its assumptions are simply the nature of reality. You walk into the negotiation with the unhurried energy of someone reviewing terms that are largely already settled. You engage with the challenge with the calm curiosity of someone who finds the opposition intellectually interesting rather than personally threatening. You respond to the attempt to destabilize you with the measured patience of someone who has seen this particular move before and found it, ultimately, unpersuasive. When you hold a frame this way, not by arguing for it but by living inside it with total conviction, something happens that no tactical manual fully captures. The other side begins to orient around your reality rather than their own. Not because they have been tricked, because a sufficiently inhabited frame exerts genuine gravitational pull. And gravity, as always, does its work without asking permission. Everything laid out in this video is a knife. It is worth saying that plainly, without softening it into something more comfortable. A knife does not have a moral position. It does not care who it cuts or why or what the cutting costs the person holding it. And the people who have picked up these particular tools across history, the frame controllers, the perception architects, the men who learned to read rooms and move through them like water, a significant number of them ended badly, not because they were outmaneuvered by someone more skilled, because the same patterns they applied outward eventually turned inward, and what was a strategic asset in a negotiation became a pathology in a marriage, a boardroom, a mirror. The paranoia that makes you hard to manipulate, left unexamined, makes you impossible to trust. The emotional control that makes you formidable in a conflict, misapplied, makes you unreachable to the people who would otherwise choose to stay. The ability to read hidden agendas, without the wisdom to know when to stop looking, eventually finds hidden agendas everywhere, including in people who had none. And a man who sees threats in every stillness and manipulation in every kindness is not powerful. He is imprisoned in a cell he built himself from the materials of his own intelligence. Machiavelli died in obscurity. His name became, for 5 centuries, a synonym for treachery, not because his observations were wrong, but because the world read the surface of his work and missed the deeper current running beneath it. The deeper current was this: the prince who relies only on the arts of power, who never builds genuine loyalty, who treats every human relationship as a resource to be managed rather than a reality to be inhabited. That prince is always one crisis away from collapse. The foundation holds only as long as the performance holds, and no performance holds forever. The Stoics arrived at the same place from the opposite direction. The interior life is not separate from the strategic life. It is the ground it stands on. A man ungoverned inside will eventually be ungoverned outside, regardless of how sophisticated his external maneuvering becomes. Use what you have learned here. Use it to see more clearly, to move more intentionally, to become genuinely harder to manipulate and genuinely more difficult to diminish. But watch the mirror as carefully as you watch the room, because the most dangerous game you will ever play is the one where you forget that you are also a player in it. There is a man you have encountered at least once in your life who was different in a way you could feel, but not immediately name. He was not the loudest person in the room. He was frequently not the most decorated, or the most credentialed, or the most visibly successful. But something about his presence had a quality that the loud and the decorated and the credentialed did not have, a quality of settledness, of interior completeness that made everything he said carry more weight than the volume of his voice should have warranted. People listened when he spoke, not because he demanded it, but because the listening felt, somehow, like the natural response to someone who clearly had no need of it. You felt, in his presence, slightly more considered, slightly more aware of what you were saying and why. As though the usual social performance, the signaling and the posturing and the subtle jockeying that fills most human interaction, like background radiation, had been quietly suspended because it was obvious to everyone in the room that it would find no purchase here. This is not a myth. It is not a personality type you are either born with or not. It is the end state of a particular kind of work, interior work, sustained over time, applied with the same rigor and patience that any real discipline demands. The emotional illegibility, practiced until it becomes natural. The structural leverage, built until alternatives are real and not imagined. The frame, inhabited so completely that it no longer requires maintenance. The silence, worn so comfortably that it has stopped feeling like a strategy and started feeling like home. The reading of human need, refined until it happens below conscious thought, a background process, always running, never announced. When these things compound, and they do compound, the way interest compounds, slowly and then suddenly, the result is not a tactician. It is not a manipulator in the crude, exhausting, eventually self-defeating sense of that word. The result is a man who is simply, profoundly, difficult to move, difficult to destabilize, difficult to diminish, difficult to reach with the ordinary tools that people unconsciously use to manage each other, the social pressure, the implied disapproval, the manufactured urgency, the emotional weather that most people allow to determine their internal state from moment to moment. He is not moved by these things because he has done the work of understanding them. And understanding a mechanism, truly understanding it from the inside out, is the only reliable way to become free of it. You cannot be manipulated by a tool you can see clearly. You cannot be destabilized by a pattern you recognized 3 moves ago. You cannot be diminished by someone whose need to diminish you. You understand more precisely than they understand it themselves. This is what all of it was pointing toward. Not dominance. Not the cold, brittle, exhausting project of controlling other people. That project fails. It has always failed. It fails because it is pointed in the wrong direction, outward, toward a world that will never be fully controllable, rather than inward, toward the one territory that can actually be governed. The man who cannot be moved is not feared because he is dangerous. He is feared because he is free. And freedom, genuine, interior, unperformed freedom, is the most quietly threatening thing one human being can demonstrate to another. Because it implies, without a word, that the cage was always optional.